I didn't want this to just be like another theory, right? And another like, oh, this is great. Like EQ, I need to go do it. I wanted to actually create something that had the framework of, okay, here are practical steps that I can do in practice so that I'm working on each one of these and measure against where I started and where I'm now showing up.
Welcome to the Friends with Benefits podcast, an Arcadia production. This is the show all about how to grow in business, lead with purpose, and live with intention. We're your co-hosting couple. I'm Jason.
And I'm Sam. Welcome to the show, friends.
Hey friends, Sam here. Before we dive in today, if you haven't heard, we are hosting our third annual Arcadia Leadership Experience this summer in Montana, July 27th through 30th. It is 65 of the top go-to-market leaders coming together for 3 days to unplug, to have intentional conversation, to get better at their craft, and to leave with relationships that turn into business and friends. So arcadialeadershipexperience.com if you'd like to learn more. Okay, so today's guest is an absolute great conversation. We have Brittany Hart, who is the founder and CEO of a company called Communiscape. She joined the Arcadia Constellation, which is our membership, to have this conversation, and all of our members went through her assessment to kind of understand the way that they communicate and the way that they best receive communication. And this was a really eye-opening conversation for myself, for our Arcadians, for Jason and I, because I think oftentimes we go into the world underestimating the impact our communication can have and all of the elements that actually play into that. So Brittany talks about a lot of elements of this today. We learned even more talking to her for the second time. And so I hope you walk away today having at least a little bit of an understanding of the way that you communicate and how others around you might be receiving that differently. These are the types of conversations we're having all the time in the Arcadia Constellation, which again is our membership. You can learn more at bearcadia.com. But sit back, enjoy today's episode, and I hope you learned something. We're so grateful you're here. Talk to you soon. Hello, friends. Hi, Jay.
What up? How we doing? Happy podcasting day. We've made it yet again.
It's one of those days, yeah, where this is the first time I'm seeing you, really, via Zoom, even though you're upstairs.
Hi there. Yeah, it's good to see you. We just had a big week here at the Yarby house. We just celebrated our kid's 5th birthday, and we've got just a week-long celebration, the big networking event, someone called it tomorrow. Biggest birthday party of all time for kids, so big week here.
Okay, I want to introduce our guest, but I also, you're right, this should be discussed. She's turning 5, and she wanted to invite her old school and her new school, and I was like, yeah, what's the problem?
Everybody's not going to come.
85 people RSVP'd to the 5th birthday party, so
you basically have the whole town there.
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, every 4-year-old, at least.
Somebody referred to it as a networking event this morning, so that's why adults are now coming.
Her teacher
It's
referred
going
to
viral.
it as that. But anyways, maybe there's some lessons there in communication and what she's doing to get so many people to show up to her parties. I'm so excited to talk to you, Brittany, today on the podcast. As we just mentioned in the intro, Brittany came and did a session with the Arcadia Constellation, and it was phenomenal. Like, I learned a lot.
A lot of really good feedback from it, too.
Totally. Jason, I don't even know that I've told you this. Maybe I have. But we were at dinner the other night, Brittany, and Jason and I were with another couple, and somebody asked, what does Arcadia do? And Jason answered, and your slides showed up in my head, which we can get into. But Jason's a yellow and I am a red, and my red was like really wanting to get to the point, and Jason was telling a great story.
Yeah, I am only yellow, and Sam made it clear that my only yellow answer wasn't quite sufficient enough the next day.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I wasn't in the moment. So, anyways, let's get into it so our listeners know what the heck we're talking about, because I think this can be such a juicy conversation. So, I'm going to just call you this. You are a communications expert, and this was something that you kind of fell into. You didn't necessarily like seek this work out, but you saw a problem and started to understand how to fix it. So, you started in the Salesforce ecosystem, which I'm super familiar with, configuration analyst, and then you were the CEO of your own consulting firm, and you were helping do like huge implementations of big Salesforce products and whatnot. And I think this is really interesting because when you and I started chatting about this, you were like, I realized that was never the problem. The technology was not necessarily what we were trying to solve for. So can you walk us through that and how it kind of led you to where you are today?
Yeah, and it's been one of those journeys that wasn't a straight path, right? So reflecting back, hindsight's always 2020 when you look at it. And so I look back now as what was kind of that pivotal moment. And the pivotal moment happened both in a professional sense and in a personal sense. So I had actually just returned from an all company expense paid trip to Disney World. My 2-year-old was with me, husband, right, whole shebang, and came back. And the CEO said, hey, Brittany, just stay out of the office a few more days. Want to make sure you're rested and have some stuff. And when I came back into the office, the communication had turned from this celebratory hitting all your goals to all of a sudden, like, we're not operating this way anymore. And it was like a complete 180 shift. And walking around the streets of New York City, having this conversation, not only, with the words that were going on, but also then with the environment, as you can imagine, in Times Square, that moment led me to Communiscape, where the entire landscape of your communication comes into play. And I know that doesn't directly answer the, technology piece, but I think that is a very pivotal moment that laid the groundwork of it's not just the one-on-one communication where this particular leader didn't have a communication architecture to have effective communication and conversation that way, but it then started to scale as I reflected on each implementation I had been a part of from a technology sense, that organizations don't have a communication architecture when they're rolling out a change. They think that saying something like, this is going to make us more efficient, is translating all the way down to the front line of, great, we're all on board. But really what those frontline individuals hear is, oh, more efficient. Okay, so either I'm going to get hit with more work or I'm going to be laid off. Like, what does more efficient actually mean for me? And that communication architecture through Communiscape's 5 scapes is really where it all came together.
So you're saying that just because it is coming from the top down, as most companies say, is like, oh, this is coming from the top down, doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a sufficient or an efficient manner of communication to actually drive people forward.
Yeah, and if we dive into that even more, think of the kindergarten game telephone, right? You just said you're having, birthday party coming up. I think it would be amazing to pay telephone with 85 people going around the circle and seeing what that message comes out to be, right? So if you can imagine in an organization, even 5 layers deep, CEO says this, then it goes to the VP, then the manager, then the team, and then the actual individual. What the message started with this and what the message ended here, unless there is a scaffolding and an infrastructure to follow in that communication, you're going to end up with a game of telephone where everyone's laughing, or in the business world, washing money down the drain at the end of it.
Or feeling undervalued, insecure, looking for new jobs. The ramifications are endless, I'm sure.
Yeah. I was coaching someone this morning, and 2 layers up, they're like, we want to know what impact your team is making. And this individual, just 2 layers, is like, I think I need to start looking for a new job. And it's like, just the questions in that, as you said, Sam, have ramifications when we don't think about what our end goal is that we're really trying to achieve.
For sure. And I like the way you put it, like that companies don't really have an infrastructure to follow, And I think we'll kind of follow this path here in a second, but like we kind of kicked off this chat by talking about the colors. I'm a high yellow, Sam's a high red, and you talk about Communiscape and your 4 communication temperaments that you walked us through within Arcadia, right? And then there's the idea that we each speak a native language in our style of communication, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about like what those 4 styles are and how, like, if someone's listening, like they can start to identify which one they default to?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite pieces. And if you are familiar with DISC, or there's another assessment out there that is named I Said This, You Heard That, both of those play into these 4 temperaments. So if you imagine a graph, across the top will be external communicators. Okay, now these are not extroverts, so don't get those too confused, because I know everyone kind of hears that and goes, oh, I'm not an extrovert, I'm an introvert. External communicators are those who speak through their thought process and lay out multiple options to get to the one that they actually think should be proceeded with, right? So when you're thinking about problems or different things like that, are you speaking out loud and kind of thinking through that? Or on the bottom are the internal processors. And so those are individuals who will hear a question and really take a moment to let it sink in, think about it. And then normally they'll come out and say, this is what I think we should do, right? So that's kind of the first 2 as you think about this graph. Then as we go vertically, we have those who are more people focused, right? Relationship focused. So looking and saying, who do I get to spend my time with today? Who's going to be a part of the project? And very focused on those people side of things. On the other side of that, we have more of our task or goal-oriented mindset. And so that is those who wake up on a Saturday morning, and I'm starting to smile because this is me. So wake up on a Saturday morning and start making the to-do list that is 20 items long and going to be very productive. Now, I want people to come with me when I'm doing it, but my default, mindscape and mindset is, what am I going to achieve today? And so when we look at those, that breaks down into the 4 colors. So yellows are external processors and people-oriented, very story-based, walking through the grocery store, see a neighbor, and all of a sudden, that neighbor becomes the whole world. And forget a little bit for the moment.
It's an obligation to stop and talk. I have to. Quit laughing, Sam.
Forget about that grocery list that Sam is waiting for at home, making dinner halfway through and then calling and saying, Jason, I'm ready for the next ingredient. Where is it? And you're like, hey, I ran into...
Sorry, I saw Mike at the store.
Yeah. So those are our yellows. Our reds are staying in that external processing, but more task oriented, right? So these are the ones who are, give me the bullet points. I trust that you did all the research. I don't need all the details of what's going on in their relationship. I just want to know, are they on or are they off, right? So kind of looking like that. Then we have our greens, which are people-focused and internal processors. They are making sure everyone's included, right? Looking for harmony. Is everyone in agreement of the decision that we're making? And really focused in there. And then last but not least are blues, and they are task-oriented and internal processors. So these individuals are making sure you have all the details, it's perfect, and really making sure we thought through all the ramifications before we just jumped in and started working on something.
I hope people are listening and saying like, yeah, I think that's me. This is a question that anecdotally, but maybe you have data on this, I don't know. But in Arcadia, it seemed that we are a leadership community, and it seemed that people skewed really heavily towards like that red, yellow. Now, there were green and blue people for sure, but how do you see that as a trend fitting over the work you've done?
All in all, I find that individuals who tend to be more external processors, yellows, reds, are more curious and want to take more assessments to find out about themselves more than our internal processors, because they're already thinking about it internally. So they're not looking to an external source to help them really process and think through it. I'll say in that's what I have noticed. But as far as leadership goes, there are leaders of every temperament that I've worked with across organizations, and they show up and just lead differently, just like the three of us speak differently and show up differently.
What are you again, Brittany? What color is yours?
So my default is red, and my
Okay.
secondary is yellow. So
Okay.
talk a lot of words.
Well, we're in good company because we literally have a podcast, so we can do that.
A lot of storytelling for you as well.
A lot of storytelling in those words, yes.
I feel like I get on this curiosity tangent quite a bit on this podcast, rightly so, but I do find it interesting to hear you say that like those reds and yellows and those leaders kind of tend to be more curious about how they operate, who they are, maybe trying to optimize it, and like just the overall exploration of themselves and finding that. So like that actually makes a lot of sense to me. Like I'm a very curious person. I'm a high yellow, like, and I'm always trying to dig into things. And Sam, I like to do research on just about everything, so including myself.
Light bulbs, whatever, you
Light
name it.
bulbs, yeah, ceiling fans, light fixtures. That's recent, I guess, but that is interesting. Like in a room of leaders, if you go into like a group of leaders, like you would say director level or above, who we talk to a lot, it's like, can you go into a room and pretty much guess kind of what the colors are? Is that a game you play with yourself? I don't know. But like you walk in like, yep, I know already this room is a bunch of reds and yellows.
I like how you phrase it as game, because I think that really is telling of your yellow temperament, right? Kind of a game of people. I definitely walk into rooms and consider that one of my professional superpowers, right? And just a casualty of what I do. But I'm definitely focused on identifying what each primary temperament is around me so that I can not just come in as a red, and I'll just translate, right, as a bull running into the ring, but coming in and looking and saying, okay, I do have a mixture of all the temperaments in here, right? So how can I show up and serve each of those individuals in my communication so that they can understand and we can make progress together? And so oftentimes a question that I get asked a lot is, how do I frame like a boardroom conversation or a conference call when I have so many temperaments in front of me that I may or may not know? And so in identifying it makes it easier to be able to have that conversation. But I really like to tell individuals it's pretty straightforward in how you structure it. First, you want to come in with a very warm yellow approach, right? You want to be very people focused, turn on that warmth, that energy when you start out any conversation. Then you're going to turn into using and leaning into your red temperament conversation, right? Because that's going to keep the individuals who are like, okay, we kind of did the niceties, but in Sam's story earlier about dinner, right? Like get to the point of what Arcadia is, right? And so then we want to present and say, these are the 3 things or the 5 things that are super important that I want you to really zero in on. And then we're going to transition into making sure that we're speaking to our blues in the room. Now, ideally, we've already given our deck or our outline to everyone who's in the meeting so that our blues and greens could engage with that ahead of time and have that internal process time. But if not, we want to almost show our homework, right? We want to present the research that we've done on the light bulbs or the ceiling fans of, hey, this is why we're making the decision we are making. We didn't just select the cheapest one and move forward. We really looked and said, okay, what are our options? And to give that to them to think about on the spot, but also after the fact. And then we want to end with our green temperament, right? And this is probably one of the hardest things for our external processors to do, is make sure that everyone in the room understands. So circling around saying, hey, I just want to make sure, do we have consensus on this? Do we want to do a 24-hour hold time to think about it and come back with any questions? But making sure that we have that inclusive decision making. Even if it's one person's decision to make, the greens are looking for, okay, are we all in agreement with this, or is there disharmony that we're sitting in as we're looking at it?
First of all, that point was what stuck out to me the most, because I think it's such a useful tool, not only like in a boardroom, but with your family, like really in any group conversation you're having.
I mean, I'm thinking about it in like a keynote session as well. It's like, how do you kick off a talk just like that?
But I think one thing that we should make really abundantly clear here is we're talking about your communication style, but that's two ways. It's also the way in which you receive information too. People could take this test or identify with a color and say, well, that's just the way I am. And then move through the world that way and be highly ineffective in understanding how to actually use those tools and how to be flexible and, meet people where they're at. One thing that you talked about with us that I think is really interesting, the difference between operating on a full tank versus an empty tank. And I've heard this conversation in many contexts, but not necessarily applied to communication. So can you walk us through how this shows up for people and what you actually mean by saying full versus empty tank in that frame?
For sure. And I think I'll back it up even more and put it in the context of the two of you have walked into an interview and they said, tell us your strengths and tell us your weaknesses.
Hate that
right?
question.
And you're like, great, I'm going to tell you my strengths, and then I'm going to reframe some strengths as weaknesses so that I don't have to actually say what I am weak at. So if we kind of take that as the starting point of strengths and weaknesses, the lens that we look at that through is not necessarily like, I'm good at this and I'm bad at this. We look at it and say, okay, I am operating from a full tank. So we all drive, right? Full tank of gas or full battery if you're out there driving an electric vehicle.
Good for you.
There you go, right? We're on full or we're on empty. And so in our communication, when we're on full, we're able to show up and communicate in a different way than if we walk into the office or sit down at the dinner table on an empty tank. Taking that a step further, when I'm on a full tank, right, I can come in and be seen as someone who can delegate and release control for other people to take and push initiatives forward. I'm operating, I got the trust in them, I've put my mindscape into that place. But if I'm coming in on an empty tank, right, it was hard getting the kids out the door this morning, I only had 1 cup of coffee instead of 3, whatever it is, and I come in, I might walk into that meeting and say, no, I'll just do it. Or can you do this, Sam? But make sure that we're following these 3 steps. And now that is not coming across as delegating, it's coming across as micromanaging and controlling, right? And so that is where the full and empty come in. It's that almost that reflective mirror of how am I going to set myself up to show up today versus just letting however I am, people have to deal with how I am.
If you're on a full tank, is there anything to be said for like you're operating from like that high color, but if you're in an empty tank, you kind of operate from like that lower color?
It's not so much in that. It's really how the characteristic presents itself. And so the characteristic is going to present itself either in a positive, in a strength, or in a negative as a weakness.
I loved how you used delegate versus micromanage because I'd never thought of those two on opposite sides of the spectrum. But in your example, they very much can be. And yes, no one loves to be micromanaged, but everybody will gladly like step up and help.
Yeah.
So
over time, like as you grow, mature, evolve, like do you find like as you begin to grow in your career or whatever, like your, quote unquote color changes, like you go from a red to a yellow at certain stages of life or blue to a yellow kind of thing? Like, is that stuff you see within leaders?
So it's a really common question that I get. And even more so to that question is, should I change or can I change? Because some people are like, hey, I'm a red. I don't want to be boss. Like, I don't want to be the red, right? I don't want to be perceived as bossy and these other things like that. And just come in and I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's always like that one leader that comes in and all of a sudden like, we got to do a 180 and everyone's like in chaos, right? And so it's like, can I change this? Help me change it. The conversation is not about changing. It's about becoming multilingual. So your communication temperament is something that is innate to you. It's kind of like your wiring, right? If we look at your genes, you're not changing the genes that you were born with. And so that is the same for your communication temperament. Now, personality is a different layer, and that is what changes and, morphs kind of over time based on the influence of the leaders around you or in your relationships. And that's kind of how you present and how you are showing up from one decade in your career to another decade. It's not necessarily like saying, hey, I'm a yellow and I want to become a blue. It's I'm a yellow, and typically that question is my boss, I think, is a blue or a green or a red, and I'm struggling communicating with them. And so that's where it's sitting down and understanding, okay, this is how I default to communicate. And again, I'll pick on, the dinner story. So Jason's telling a 5-minute story. Sam's sitting there kind of saying, hey, get to the point. And whoever you were out to dinner with, what communication temperament are they? Right. And so it's looking and Jason saying, oh, I could tell this really great story, but let me understand who's across the table from me. And maybe I just give them, hey, Arcadia is XYZ, but I have this anecdotal story that will help you understand it better. Can I share that with you?
I think that's such an important point because it's not like we're going to sit down at the dinner table and be like, really quickly, can you take this assessment? So how do you walk through the world and like, what are the you kind of gave some already, but any other telltale signs of like, this is who I'm talking to, this is what they need?
First is when you ask them a question, noticing how long is their answer. So that's going to help you understand external versus internal processor a little bit, as well as are they chomping at the bit before you even finish the question to answer, or did they listen all the way through and then have a little pause and then answer? So that'll help you with external and internal processing kind of right off the bat. Then as you're thinking about it and you ask them like, hey, how was your weekend? Or whatever small talk you kind of start with, then do they go into more of a people focus of, hey, I spent the weekend with a really great friend and we hadn't seen each other for a while and we happened to go shopping? Or do they go into, yeah, I had a really productive weekend and I got 3 things done, but one of the items, had a lot of steps to it. That then helps you on more of the people focus versus the task focus. And I threw in the multiple steps because that then clues you down into more of that blue temperament because they're thinking through the process. Whereas the reds would be like, yep, I got everything done on my to-do list. It was great.
Brittany, this is every time I talk to you, I can't help but smile because as you're saying that, I have a specific person in mind who's like one of my best friends, and I am very red. And now, after this conversation, I realize she's very blue. And there's so many times where she's telling me a story, and I'm like, oh my God. Like, you went to the grocery store. That's the point. So.
I feel like, too, like, listening to you kind of talk and say that, I'm thinking about how I listen. I feel like there's probably some telltale signs within body language as well that you can almost get a read on like what kind of person you are. Like if, you're a yellow and you kind of communicate and you're probably leaning really into the story, kind of hanging on, as it were. If you're maybe like a red, you're kind of like, you can kind of see the agitation begin. You can almost like navigate the conversation based off like how they're receiving the way that you're communicating.
Yes. And in Zoom meetings, if you're a camera on type of place, you can also identify that from all the nonverbal body language as well, right? You're going to see your reds are going to be the first to shift the eyes and start doing something else on a call when it opens.
I'm constantly scanning every window to see what they're doing. Maybe that's the yellow in me. It's like, I want to make sure they're all paying attention here.
Yep. The blues are going to hang in a little bit longer, but if it stays on more of that, small talk and not getting to the point, then they're going to kind of be the next ones who go off and they're going to look like they're, going through and doing work during that time. And then your greens are going to hang in no matter what's happening, full attention the whole time because you are the most important thing right now.
So higher greens. Okay, here's a question that I just thought of. Is there, I mean, I'm sure it's different from organization to organization, but assuming that reds communicate well with other reds, is that a fair statement?
I mean, yes and no.
Not necessarily only reds, but do like colors communicate best with similar colors?
So I'll give you a story and see if the answer reveals itself, right? So Sam and I, we're both reds, right? And so we're sitting and we're getting to know each other. And our introduction call ends about 5 minutes into it. And so from that, Sam walked away and said, Brittany's great. We should, have our own podcast, Arcadia. And it's like, oh, this is wonderful. That was a quick decision. Like, let's do it all in.
Got everything you wanted right
Right?
there in 5 minutes.
Right there, 5 minutes, knew what we should do with it. Right? And so in the same way, Sam and I get on the next call and I'm working on something and our call ends 5 minutes, right? And Sam's kind of like, oh, that was really quick. Brittany made a decision and moved on from that. So with that, if we are both okay that we're making quick decisions because we're similar, then the communication in the relationship is doing fine. But if either one of us starts thinking, hey, did we give enough information? Do we know enough like that? Then our communication style can start being in conflict with each other because too similar can start kind of rubbing that way.
Okay, that makes sense. Let me ask you one more follow-up question on this. I feel like everything I've been trained to think, and having been on a few executive teams, the general idea is if you are communicating with executives, make it very short and concise, which in my head says red. So the question being, does the role in which we play in a company influence our communication style?
So it influences, I don't want to say your communication style. So it influences how you present it. So it's called masking when you start trying to be something that you're not innately. So if you thought about taking the assessment and you're like, oh, I want to make sure that I score a certain way or I'm perceived a certain way, then you're masking into the communication temperament that you think is going to be rewarded, which we do see in organizations, right? With leaders who are maybe predominantly red, you start trying to talk red, which it comes back to kind of your motives and then how you're doing it. Are you doing it in an authentic way where you are trying to make sure that you're communicating in their temperament so that they can understand what you're trying to achieve? Or are you doing it from the motive of, I'm just trying to be like them because this is how I think that I need to be? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Totally.
It does.
How do these communication styles play out differently in your environments? Like to that point, like how do they play out differently at home versus at work? In the workshop you did with Arcadia, right? I feel like a lot of people connected it to their personal lives. And I feel like that has to happen quite often. Does it differ where you are, and how does mastering one area of that help the other?
Practicing and mastering things at home sometimes can be easier than in the workplace. So I'll share another kind of coaching moment recently with a client. They're a high red, and I said, okay, what personal information do you know about anyone you work with? And they're like, I know information about my boss. And I was like, okay, cool. Why do you think you know information about your boss, but no one else? And he's like, well, I need things from him. I'm like, okay, so we have a core red, right? Task motivated, trying to get promoted, very focused on that. And so with that, I gave homework 2 weeks ago and I said, okay, I want you to get to know something outside of the work context about individuals in these 4 different groups. Came back, didn't do the homework. I'm like, okay, why didn't you do it? He's like, well, it's been really busy and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, well, let's peel that back another layer. And he's like, well, I think it's weird just to ask people about themselves. And I'm like, okay, like I could get that if you don't have a relationship. So question could be, tell me, when you're not at work, what are you doing? Just an easy question. It doesn't have to be like, how many kids do you have? Where do you live? Right? We don't have to get super personal.
What's your social security number?
What's your social mother's maiden name? Like, let's just go down the list, right? but like just to get to know them. So with that, right? So work didn't want to step into that because how do I do that in a professional setting? But you go into the personal and he's like, yeah, I know everything there is to know about my friends. Like I'll ask them about other things, even if we are working on, a goal together or a task together, enter into those personal conversations. And so oftentimes it's easier to start on that personal side than professional on practicing some of these skills and building them up.
Is that something you would encourage as you're coaching people, is to try to work on these skills at home so that they can bring it into work and make it more holistic?
It is. And so we also have a peer assessment so they can have others around them rate themselves as well on their Communiscape. So they kind of give, like, this is how I think that I show up and I'm perceived outside of the 4 colors, the Communiscape assessment. And then they have those around them fill it out. And then we show where they align or where, they're off in how they're being perceived moving through their world.
Your peers are assessing you or assessing themselves
Yes.
in context? Oh, I would like to try that
So
one.
you self-assess and then you would ask like Sam to like take it on you.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Okay, just to like bring people into the fold here, because we've talked a lot about like the colors, and what you do is so much broader than that. There's 5 terrains within communication that you kind of have talked about. So mindscape, speakscape, voicescape, listenscape, and impactscape. Did I get them all?
You did,
Okay.
and in the right order. So gold star.
Excellent.
Very nice.
So first of all, just give us like, what are those? Let's just start there before I start asking you questions on them.
So we spent a lot of time, as you said, on the colors, which is just one layer of the words that you choose. And so that goes into our second scape, which is the speakscape, right? So default words we choose and how we talk. But before that, we have our mindscape. And this is really how we mentally organize our communication and our information, as well as the stories we're telling ourselves before we walk into any situation. So this is your mental layer of everything going on within your brain before any words come out. And so we work on that because obviously whatever is happening at that layer is going to then influence everything else from there. So that's really where Mindscape hones in on. Speakscape, again, we spent a lot of time on that, but it's just the words that you're saying default come out of your mouth. Voicescape starts going into the mechanisms of how you communicate. So we've talked about this throughout, right? We talked about nonverbal communication. We've talked about a little bit, I think, about like how we pace and our tone. And I shared specifically in Arcadia about our pitch, right? So the lower your pitch, the more authority you carry and credibility when you're talking. And so Voicescape goes into the real mechanics of how you speak and how you have your nonverbal communication. From there, we go into our listenscape, so our 4th scape, and that is the environment you create around yourself to receive information. So I'm sure you've all walked up to individuals and started talking, and automatically, like non-verbally, you're like, oh, this person doesn't actually care what I'm saying, or their eyes are darting elsewhere, right? That's part of the listenscape of what environment are you creating to receive information, and then how are you actually processing and reflecting back to the person across from you that you're hearing it. And so that piece is normally the most overlooked piece because none of us from elementary school through whatever level of, post-grad you've had a listening class. You've had reading, you've had speech, right? You've had debate even, but you've never had how to listen. It's just a skill that we don't lean into. And then coming out of all of that is the impactscape. And this is the part that us Reds struggle with the most, I would say, is because we can't control it. This is the output of the 4 scapes that have led up to it. And so either through our communication, we are leaving a positive impact or we're leaving a negative one. And then the length of that impact is also a component of our communication. So if you think about the story I opened with in New York City, all of that, that has had a lasting impact because I'm talking about this now 7, 8 years later. And it stuck with me in that negative context that actually pushed me to change. And so I've taken that negative impact and actually turned it into now a positive impact because it was a catalyst so that I never make anyone else experience that in my communication.
Okay, so quick question on that. I'm thinking some listeners will be hearing that and saying like, well, bad news is just going to leave a bad impact. Do you agree with that? Or is there a way that you can deliver less than desirable news and have an impact that's not detrimental?
I mean, nobody wants to get bad news, right? No one wants to hear, hey, you're underperforming what we expected. That just doesn't sound good to anyone. But there is a way to deliver that is a catalyst rather than a paralyzer. And in understanding the communication temperament of the person across from you, and then designing this whole communiscape around the message you're sharing, there are ways that it will land differently than if you just came in and said, you're underperforming, we're putting you on a PIP and you have 30 days to shape up or ship out.
One of the things I'm listening to, like the 5 terrains, and I have a chance to hear it again, is like, I think it's beneficial for just about anybody because it sounds like basic emotional intelligence, right? Like, how do you level up your EQ? And I know a lot of people who could really stand to level up their EQ based off certain of these terrains, right? So the more that you kind of think about these and, 5 terrains, I think the more you can think about how you can really raise your emotional intelligence, which I think is crucial for anyone in a leadership position.
That's the piece for Communiscape, is that I didn't want this to just be like another theory, right? And another like, oh, this is great, like EQ, I need to go do it. I wanted to actually create something that had the framework of, okay, here are practical steps that I can do in practice so that I'm working on each one of these and measure against where I started and where I'm now showing up.
I appreciate it so much because, clearly it's very in-depth. And I think the majority of us walk through the world saying, well, I communicated that clearly. I said what I needed to say. I delivered the facts, like whatever, but I guess that's just Speakscape most of the time. And most people, myself included, don't take into consideration the other 4 terrains as often as I should.
And it happens on a personal level, but it also happens kind of where we started on that organizational level. If you're noticing this, like personally, I'm not even thinking of these other 4 areas. Take that into an organization, not thinking about different areas and communicating a change initiative.
Speaking of framework, you talked to our group about like a daily practice that you use with your coaching clients. I have a tendency to fill in the blank, but I'm going to choose to fill in the blank. It's a simple, great reframe. It's very practical. So what are some other small, like repeatable exercises that someone can do or start after hearing this podcast to become more intentional about how they communicate?
And Brittany, could you fill in that to like give us a real life example? Could you fill in that I have a tendency to, but I choose to, so people know?
So you're going to put in, I have a tendency to, and it's going to be something that you think is kind of negative, right? Or that weakness. And the other is going to be, I'm going to choose to, and put in a strength or a positive. So for me early on, and I think just a lot of companies, I have a tendency to jump in and speak over other people before they're finished talking. Instead, I'm going to choose to pause until they're all the way done and then respond. Now, the hard thing about this particular one is with multiple people on Zoom calls, etc. Sometimes you're now 3, 4 people deep when you're like, but I have to get my thought out. And so that's a really hard one to step into, but it's a really powerful one because once you start doing it, people will notice and actually call on you and say, hey, you haven't jumped in yet. And they'll start noticing that tendency and that shift. And so that's one of those practices of like very easy to do in the morning when you're getting ready or sit down at your computer. Another one that I really like to use is before each conversation, right? If you're going into a one-on-one or a meeting, sitting down saying, what is the goal of this conversation? Is it to understand the other person's perspective? Is it to deliver hard news that doesn't destroy, doesn't tear them down? What is the goal of that meeting? And so setting that and writing that out before you start helps put that mindscape in place for the other scapes to follow. And then at the end of that, writing down and saying, okay, how do I think that went? What did I do well? And what would I tweak for next time? So it's the real time mindscape preparation and then noticing, okay, what was that impact scape that I think happened there?
I think those are super helpful. And so simply put, a lot of times we don't even have that intention or pause to even consider any of it. And so that's a great first step, is to just, what's the goal here and what was the impact afterwards? And
yeah. And taking those 30 seconds. I mean, we're all looking at our calendars, right? We're like, oh, I got to go from thing to thing to thing. And just taking that 30 seconds. And then ideally at the end of the week, looking and saying, okay, how did the week go in my communication?
I have two questions. One is very random, but I just am so curious. Do you think that certain roles fall into certain colors? So for instance, like customer service people who have to be very empathetic and detail oriented, like do they tend to fall into one color versus salespeople or something else? Have you seen any trends like that?
I would love to say that I have enough data to speak to that because it is something that I have been very curious about. We have used this in the past to look at communication temperament and roles that we're hiring for. And so with that, I'm looking at how do I expect that role to show up? So if we think about a Salesforce consultant role or even my role as a coach, if I'm presented with a question and I need time to process it, right, before I feel comfortable giving an answer, and the client across the table from me is expecting me to know everything off the cuff because that's kind of what we expect a consultant to be like, oh, yes, we can do this. A internal processor in that expectation of the role is going to be in conflict with who they are and what's expected within the role. Now, that's not to say that they can't do the role, that they're not going to be great at it, but it's something to set up with client, with consultant of, hey, I'm going to take your question very seriously and think about it. And I'm always going to come back to you with an answer. I'm not going to just give you an answer off the cuff. That sets up for someone with that communication temperament, setting those communication expectations. But it's research I would really like to do to see if there's roles that people gravitate towards more based on their communication temperament.
Yeah, I think that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I think the whole thing's just kind of fascinating, just like the general art of communication and all that like actually has to go into it to effectively communicate, lead a team, lead up, share in. It's like, it's wild that all this actually has to go into it, but it absolutely does.
And how much it's just like not thought about, expected to be second nature. It's just the way humans move through the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And communication is everything.
This is, again, an anecdotal question, but how much of the world would change if people would just take a minute and think about how they communicate? Like, you can't give a concrete answer to that, but I'm just so curious. Like, not only in organizations and leadership, but in marriages, in world stages, in politics, like all of it, if we would just take a minute and assess like who you are in the situation and the people around you, man. So go, Brittany. Go change the world.
Change the world.
I'm trying, but I think the real question, Sam, there is changing the world is pausing and thinking about what does Sam, what does Jason need to hear in this moment? Not what does Brittany just want to blab out of her mouth.
What do I want to say?
Right.
Yeah.
Intentional.
I think that's really where the real change comes, is speaking into what others need to hear in that moment, not what I have the desire to share and put out of my mouth.
Yeah, for sure.
Simply put, difficult to execute, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
So,
I mean, think about that last rumor that you heard and you're like, oh, got to keep it to myself. Jason doesn't need to hear it, but I really want to share it at the dinner table.
let's say someone listening did want to go implement some of these changes and take the first step with their own team, but they didn't quite want to roll out a full workshop. All right, what would you recommend they do on Monday morning to start like shifting their communication culture?
I think the first thing is really diving into the listenscape to understand the people around you. So hopefully through this, they have identified their default temperament. I think most of us can pretty self-identify into one of those four. But then on Monday morning to sit back and say, okay, what is John's temperament? What is Victoria's temperament? What are these people that I work with around me? What are their temperaments? And then starting to think about that in their communication.
Start with
Start
listen.
there, folks.
Okay, so Brittany, tell us a little bit about, like, you've talked about coaching. You do this for like a one-on-one. You do this for organizations. You do workshops. Like, how does somebody get in touch with you? What kind of work do they expect to do with you? All those things.
So one-on-one, I think coaching is pretty self-explanatory, but we really focus on where you're at and where you're trying to get, with Communiscape and those 5 scapes being the real change factor in how you get there. So that's really what coaching looks like from that capacity. From corporate workshops, I mean, similar conversations to what we had here, but going in and breaking it down a little bit more for specifically what is being held up within that team or within the organization. Again, looking at where you're at and where they're trying to get, and where it just keeps kind of grinding and feeling resistance and not just smooth sailing. The last place that we really engage is with change projects, specifically on the IT side, because everyone's architecting the system and doing training and all of that. But we see huge adoption rates increase when we actually start looking at that communication layer and architecting that. And so we work with teams on understanding where the resistance might be around an IT project and getting that resistance to contagious adoption with everyone.
I think that's a crucial missing layer for a lot of companies that are trying to implement something like this.
Yeah. And we look and we tie hard numbers to it. So we're not just talking soft skills, because I know everyone's like, oh, communication, it's a soft skill. We actually look and tie numbers of where you're at to where we get you to. And that's then where the compensation is based. So we don't come in and just add another hourly rate to you. We put your money and our money where our mouth is.
Love it.
That's awesome.
That's incredible. Well, Brittany, this has been another fascinating conversation. Thanks for taking the time to chat colors,
And
labeling
terrains.
people and terrains. But I loved it. It's very fascinating. I took a lot of notes, actually. So there you go. Some things to start implementing, and hopefully you guys at home, listeners, took some value out of this. You're going to go evaluate yourself, and I think that's kind of the first start, is like being self-aware enough to know that you need to think about your communication style, your listening style, where you fit and within those terrains, and where you need to begin to make some improvements to raise that EQ. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Friends, we'll see you next time.